As a fresh-faced social work student, I just knew that I was going to change the world. I knew that the world's problems could be solved with the help of none other than a social worker. And in 3 years, 2 months, and 5 days, and a ton, let me tell you, a ton of student debt later, I would be it. I've always known, even as a child, that my calling was to serve people. And I believe that social work would give me a platform to fight political, economic, and gender injustices, and heal the human spirit. Social work would turn me into a real-life Houdini. But instead of pulling a rabbit out of my hat, my feats of magic would include giving a homeless family a new home, or a sense of safety back to a woman who had survived being raped. During undergrad and graduate social work school, we often examine case studies about social issues like homelessness, poverty, violence, and mental health. We learn how to diagnose these problems and where to go to find solutions. Let's take, for example, an elderly man who's lonely and on the brink of losing his housing. What do? The answer is actually quite simple: a referral to a housing organization. And for the loneliness, easy: a referral to a mental health center. Problem solved. Well, that's how I thought about it until I actually had a chance to try that very same approach. Yes, I know. In 2012, during my second year of college, I was an intern volunteering at a homeless outreach program. I was working full-time and going to school, but for 2 nights a week, for 6 hours a night, I would ride around the city in this big Greyhound-type bus that traveled through the south side of Chicago, delivering sandwiches, coffee, and cookies to people who came to the bus stop needing help. And I can remember one brisk wintry night, I met a young man who had lost a grandmother that raised him. He had no other family, and because he had spent years being her caretaker, he didn't have any other job skills. He lost everything when she died, including his human spirit and his will to fight. He was standoffish, observing me from an emotional distance. I'm pretty sure he was wondering whether I was going to be there short term or whether I was going to stick. And well, I did stick. And no matter how tired I was, no matter how long my day had been, I wanted to make him feel welcome. And for weeks, we would see each other. At first, our relationship consisted of a friendly, "Hey, how are you?" But one night I found myself asking him, "Can you tell me about yourself?" and really wanting to know. That's when he told me about the depression that plagued him, and how he lost his housing, and then how he lost himself. But why would he trust me with his story? Well, because in the 2 or 3 months that we had been gradually bonding over not-so-tasty sandwiches and coffee, I went from looking at him through a clinical lens as a problem to be solved, to looking at him as a human being like myself, who's gone through loneliness, who's felt sadness, and who suffered loss. He told me he found support in a church that his grandmother had frequented. The only thing that sustained him during this time was to do chores, really just enough to earn a modest income to keep him from starving. And he would take tall church candles. You guys know the ones, the tall ones with the pictures of the saints on them? Well, he'd take those and he'd light them in honor of his grandmother, and he would place them all around himself to keep warm. During those bitter, cold Chicago nights when he slept in his truck, he told me he had a passion for culinary arts and dreamt and idolized of being a chef, just like the ones he'd seen on TV. So after a few months with a rising spirit, he told me he applied to a job at a local food catering company, and he got it. With the new sense of independence, he worked, still living out of his car, but was able to work to the point where he was able to now rent out a room. And so let's flash forward a year before we run into each other again in the most, let me tell you guys, the most unlikeliest of places, a convenience store gas station. Yes, I know, mind blown. He was buying fruits and vegetables. He told me he was finishing his second semester at a renowned culinary arts program at a major college in Chicago. After I expressed my extreme elation, and I'm 100,000,000% sure I embarrassed him because I was so excited, he told me something. He told me that during his darkest times, those hours he spent in the outreach bus, those were his safe haven. The only time that he felt equal to, and not less than, the only time that he felt his human spirit come alive. When I look back on this experience, I realized that my education had taught me how to diagnose people. But in order to truly empower people, we need to do more than just diagnose them. We need to raise them up by understanding, respecting, and having compassion for their struggles, instead of just labeling the reasons for what it is that they're going through. See, all of us are like those little Russian dolls that you keep unpacking. And inside one doll, you'll find another and another and another. The first doll is the outside of a person, the surface of who we are. This is what the world sees and what the world will judge us by. Now, when you unpack that first doll, you'll find the second. Those are the fears and concerns that all of us hold close inside. And now, when you unpack that second doll, you'll find the third. That's our trauma, the deepest, most profound hurts which we've suffered, the unhealed trauma which weakens us. But if we can find a way to heal, then we can unlock the final doll and reveal what's at our most essential core. That's the power of our human spirit. The opportunity to connect with people comes at times that you may not realize, but those are the moments that can make the most impact. Those are the moments that can last longer than you can ever know. But sometimes that's just not enough. And I learned that really early on in my career, when I worked with children at an Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, detention center. And let me start off by saying this. I know that ICE has been in the news a lot lately. But there is nothing new about the pain and the suffering of men, women, and children that come to this country. I met a young girl, no more than 12 years of age. Our first meeting began just as countless others had. I introduced myself and I said, "Hi, my name's Nellie, and I'm gonna be your social worker." I had an intake document, basically a list of questions I'm supposed to go through and ask, like, what countries did you journey through? Do you have family in the United States? Do you know the name of your coyote? Do you owe him or her any money? But this time was so different because we didn't get a chance to go through this document. I sat in astonishment as this girl took a deep breath. She looked up at me. Her face was drenched in tears. And she started to tell me why she fled her home country. She told me the sexual assault she experienced, the bone-shattering fear of being kidnapped by a local gang, the relief she felt knowing that she had survived the journey through the desert, and the exhaustion she succumbed to when she turned herself into ICE as soon as she crossed the border. This was my first time working with someone who had such a deep and profound level of trauma. And I wanted to take her home because I wanted to rescue her and I wanted to make sure that nobody else could hurt her. But I realized that even though we connected profoundly, and even though I saw her humanity, that would never be enough to help her heal completely. For the next 6 to 8 months, we worked tirelessly. We met several times a week as we started to unpack those first layers of her trauma, now that her life was not in immediate danger anymore. And during this time, I struggled to find the emotional wherewithal to sustain myself because her story was so incredibly hard. But also because I knew that I could not single-handedly heal her human spirit. but walking away was not an option. And at least I was able to help her start feeling safe again and begin to unpack those first levels of her trauma. The people I work with don't get an easy way out, and neither do I. And yet, for all the times that I am completely overwhelmed, I go to work every day, hoping to help change someone's life, hoping to help make an impact in someone's life. I've heard it said that a doctor can save a life, but a social worker can help give you a reason to live. After I earned my master's degree, I became an ER trauma social worker at Mount Sinai, a level 1 trauma hospital in the west side of Chicago. And let me tell you guys something. You see everything in an emergency room, from opioid withdrawals to fussy babies to people who come back with terminal illnesses. One day in my second year of the ER, I had a patient come in with multiple gunshot wounds. We knew he was coming from the trauma alerts that reverberated through the hallways of the hospital. And as the stretcher crossed the threshold into the trauma bay, we braced ourselves and we took a deep breath. Doctors started working, fighting to save his life. Meanwhile, I put my gloves on and I started going through his clothes, drenched in blood. I was looking for his identification and a means to reach his family. And as I was doing this, I heard a faint ring coming from his coat pocket. It was Mom calling. I picked up the phone. Our conversation was brief. I could hear her voice quivering, desperately wanting to know if her baby was still alive. And all I could tell her was, you need to come to the hospital and you need to come right now. Over the next few days, I watched on as this loving mother struggled with the hardest challenge of her life. Her son was in a coma and he may never come out of it. And yet, day after day, her faith never wavered. And I saw how her human spirit carried her through. Every day as I made my way into the emergency room, she would tell me things like, we have to take this one day at a time. We have to stay positive about this. Now, these are the things that I usually tell people, but here she was supporting me. For the next 5 days, she sat at his bedside with a strength that was truly unlike anything I had ever seen. And her son fought and he fought, but his body was tired. And on the 5th day, his heart stopped. And that's when I was told that he was brain dead. And now his mother would need to be told. And I had tremendous fear for what was coming because I knew then that her life was about to change forever. But I also knew that I needed to rise above those feelings so that I can be fully present for her. And this time was different because not only was I able to be present for her, she had been present for me as well. And as we sat in the room holding hands, the doctor and the nurse walked in and they told her. And still reeling from finding out that her son had now been pronounced, she was now faced with a decision of whether or not to donate his organs. And she pulled me to the side. And she said, I don't want my son's death to be in vain. It needs to mean something. And I told her, if you have the opportunity to share his life with others, I would take it. And as she consented for organ donation, she was not a woman consumed by loss, but instead armored encourage. And I realized that even though I could not protect her or myself from the grief and the pain that are just naturally part of living, we could be there for each other. We can lift up each other's human spirit because the human spirit is powerful. As a social worker, I am so very often written into the stories and the lives of people that I serve. And the most beautiful life lessons have truly come from the most tragic of experiences. But I've learned that our ability to persevere through any struggle or any suffering cannot be stopped. That's not what I learned in social work school, but that's the kind of social worker and human being that I strive to be every single day. Thank you.